Hi, and welcome to Caterpillar Cross Stitch. My name is Ford, and this week I'm going to teach you the 3 most beginner-friendly ways to start your thread when cross-stitching. The last one is my favorite, so make sure you stick around for that. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and do me a favor and like this video and then leave me a comment when we're done. Also, make sure you don't miss out on any of the other aspects of the Caterpillar Cross Stitch community, like the Facebook group and the Instagram, and sign up for the newsletter. You'll get 10 free PDF cross stitch patterns instantly, worth £60, plus you'll get all the latest news of any upcoming projects. So make sure you click the link in the description or the pinned post so you don't miss out on that. Alright, in order to start stitching, the first thing that we're going to want to do is cut ourselves a workable length of floss. Now your floss may be on a skein like this, or it might be wound onto a bobbin, or if you're working from a Caterpillar kit, it might be wound onto one of these handy little floss cards. The color I'm going to work with today is wound onto a bobbin here, so I'm going to pull some off and cut it. Now, usually what I recommend is to have a working strand that's about the same length as your fingertips to your elbow. The reason that that's the length I recommend is that you can pull that all the way through your project without having to engage your shoulder in the pull, so that makes it a lot less uncomfortable and tiring to stitch. Now, the one exception to that will be the last method that I teach you, so make sure that you pay attention when we get to that one. But I'm going to go ahead and cut my piece off here. And then the thread that we use for cross stitch and embroidery is 6-strand embroidery floss. So this looks like one piece of floss, but it's actually 6 individual strands. And we're only going to be working with usually 1, 2, or 3 of those. So for the first 2 techniques I'm going to teach you, we're going to be using 2 strands. So we'll want to separate 2 of them out. The easiest way for me to do that is just to kind of tap the end of the floss, and you can see that those separate out. Then what I'll do is pull on that one and hold on to the other 5 strands. Just gently pinching those ones, making sure that it doesn't tangle up as it bunches up in my hand. And that one strand will be easily separated out. So I'll just straighten this out a little bit and then go ahead and pull out a second one. Most of the time, unless a pattern says otherwise, you're going to be working with 2 strands of embroidery floss. So that's why I'm pulling 2 out here. So now I want to thread my needle. And people will use needle threaders or other specialized tools for this. I don't really like that very much. So personally, I am a floss licker. I like to lick the end of the floss, get it just a little bit damp. And then I'll use my fingers to kind of make a little blade of the floss so that it's a little easier to fit through the eye of my needle. And then I'll put both strands through the eye of my needle and pull a little bit of it through so that it doesn't fall out. And now I'm ready to make my first stitch. Now I've got my floss loaded on into an embroidery hoop and then being held with a stand just to hold it steadier so that you can see what I'm doing. But you can hold the fabric in your hand, or you can use a hoop or a Q-snapper. There are a number of different ways to hold the fabric. Now the first technique I'm going to show you is almost certainly the most traditional way to start a thread for cross stitch. It's definitely the way that I was originally taught. We're actually going to start from the back of our project. But we want to figure out where to do that stitch first. So we're going to bring our needle up through from the back to the front with the floss hanging on it. Now I'm just going to leave that there for a moment and turn this around to the back. And I'm going to pull my floss most of the way, but not all of the way through the fabric. So I'm leaving about a little over an inch or somewhere around 3 centimeters of floss here. Now I'm going to turn it back to the front. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, with my non-stitching hand, with my off hand, I'm going to grab onto that little remaining tail of floss. And I'm going to make my first stitch. So personally, I usually stitch from the bottom left corner of the stitch to the top right corner of the stitch and push my needle down through to the back. So that's my first half stitch. Now I usually stitch using what we call the Danish method, where I'll do each stitch a half a stitch at a time. So I'm going to turn the project back over to the back side so that I can see what I'm doing, and I'm going to make sure that that first return stitch is what I like to call it when I bring the needle back forward to the front of my project. My first return stitch, I want it to be over the top of that little tail that we've left. Now I can turn my project back around to the front, and that first stitch will hold that little remaining tail right in place so that my next few stitches, as I progress from left to right here, will go over the top of that tail. And the friction from the stitches that I do afterwards will hold that tail in place. So I'll just continue on down my row of stitches here. And with my finger that I'm using on the underside of my project, I can feel where that tail I've left is. So I'm just making sure that each of these stitches goes over the top of it. So I'll just do however many stitches the pattern calls for there, and then I'll go back the other way and I'll cross them all. And again, I'll be able to feel if my tail has come out of place or is poking up. It'll just kind of feel wrong back there. So I'll just cross all of these. And then if we take a look at the back side again, you can see that my little return stitches have all gone over the top of that tail on the back. So the little bit of excess that I've got right here, I'll just go ahead and lift that up, snip it off so it doesn't get tangled up later. And that's plenty strong enough to hold that in there for all the cross stitches that I'm going to do later. And I'm just going to hang on to that thread because next week I'm going to show you how to finish off a thread when you're done with it. So I'll just save that for next week's instruction. And the nice thing about this method is that you only have to do it that way for the first one. As long as you work from contiguous areas and work your way out from stitches that you've already done, with the subsequent needlefuls of color or different colors, instead of having to stitch over a loose tail, you can just tuck it under a few of the stitches that are already there, and then that friction will hold that for you while you go out and do the next group of stitches. Now the next technique I'm going to teach you exploits a similar aspect of the stitching, which is that you can use the return stitches on the back to hold the tails of your threads when you start them. This makes it a little bit easier though if you're using a stand or if you don't have use of both hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by tying a little knot in the end of the thread that I have already loaded into my needle. Now if you were taught to cross stitch by someone who's a traditionalist, the word knot is a dirty word to a lot of cross stitchers. We generally don't like to use knots because they can make it difficult to display the piece nicely. We're not going to be leaving this knot though, so that's okay. This is what's called a waist knot method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by pushing my needle down through the fabric, somewhere a few stitches away from where I actually want to start. So a place that I'm going to be stitching towards in a little while. And I'm going to pull it down through till that knot is sitting on the surface of the fabric. And then what I will do is I will make my first few stitches working towards where that knot is. And basically that knot is doing the job of holding my tail in place against the back of the fabric for me so that I don't have to turn it over. And then I can just do my first few stitches stitching towards that knot, and trust that my return stitches on the back will be holding that in place for me. And then once I get over to where my waist knot is, I just want to lift it up away from the fabric as far as I can, get my embroidery scissors down in there, and give it a snip. And then when I stitch through that hole, my needle and thread will pull the little tiny bit of it that's there back around to the back. And now I'll just go ahead and cross all my stitches. And again, I'm going to show you next week a few different ways to end threads, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that one there for now. But if we look around to the back again, you can see that those stitches look pretty much exactly the same. We've got our tail stitched over, and those return stitches are holding the tail to keep it from coming out, and then we can just move on stitching from there. And the final technique that I'm going to teach you is known as a loop start. Remember I said earlier that you want to cut your floss about the length of your fingertips to your elbows. That's where you get the two strands that you would normally use. Now with the loop start, rather than using two strands of floss, we're going to use one strand of floss, and we're going to fold it in half so that the two ends that we put in our needle are actually the two ends of the same piece of floss instead of one end of two pieces of floss. So if you're going to use a loop start, you can go ahead and cut your floss about twice as long as you normally would otherwise, because you're going to be folding it in half. So like I mentioned, we're going to stick both ends of a single piece of floss through the eye of our needle. And so that will look the same on the needle end, 2 strands of floss coming through the needle eye. But on the other end, instead of 2 ends, we'll have a loop or a bite. And that is going to be the key to this starting method. So what we're going to do is we're going to feed our needle through to the front of our project. And we're going to pull it almost, but not quite all the way through. You can see that that leaves a little loop on the back here. That's the loop of our loop start. So what we'll do is we will just stick the needle through that loop and then pull it down tight. And that makes a little kind of cinch there. Now there's also a way to do this from the front of the project so you don't have to turn it over for the other beneficial reasons that I already mentioned. I actually only learned this one recently, so I'm going to show you how that's done. Basically, we're going to start our thread wherever we need to do our first stitch, and we're going to pull it down through most of the way, just like we did on the back, and then bring our needle back up to the surface. And again, loop it right through that little loop that we've created, and I'll pull it parallel to the surface of the fabric to pull my stitch tight, because that way that little loop or bite will go down into one of the corners. And then I can just stick my needle down through that same corner, making sure not to stick it through the loop, or that will just undo our loop start. And then when it gets down to the surface, if I give it a tiny little tug, it just pops around to the back. And then I can just do the stitches that I need to do in that area. You can see how fast and easy that was getting me off and stitching. And the other thing that's nice about it is how very tidy it leaves the back. We've got this one little stitch here that's slightly irregular because of the loop, but other than that, I just have perfectly uniform stitches on the back, as opposed to these tails that you'll see kind of making horizontal lines appear through otherwise perfectly vertical lines on the back of a project. So it's a little bit neater. There's nothing to tangle or to remember or anything like that. So personally, that is how I start my stitches 90% of the time now, especially if I have a large area of a particular color. I can just keep starting new ones. And I'd been stitching for a few years before I discovered that loop start, and let me tell you, it was a total game changer for me. It's been taking the cross-stitch world by storm, and it's how most people start their stitches these days. You can see that if you're only using 1 strand or 3 strands, it can be a little bit difficult, but make sure that you check out my video on how to do loop start with 1 or 3 strands to solve those problems. Like I said, I wanted to teach you the 3 most beginner-friendly ways to start a cross stitch, and there are quite a few other methods out there, and you can find those in our other videos. But that is all I have for you today. I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next week.